Perfect. So just a quick recap on all of the sort of different criteria to consider when you're making a software selection. So I'm going to spend, and I have been spending the majority of time really helping you guys think through how do you understand and develop out your functionality and features needs. I think that's a really important part of this process, but my attention to it should not be perceived as the fact that the rest of these are less important. So really keep in mind all of these selection criteria in going into vendor conversations. Identify what your nice to haves and need to haves are around these, and make sure that when you're doing your vetting and final selection processes that you're keeping all of these in mind. So this is a framework that I sort of talked about in terms of what is the overall technology search process, and just want to sort of bring up a couple of notes on each of these. And the first is to assemble the team. And I want to reiterate that the most important part of this to me is to identify a strong project manager who's going to be able to lead this process. There's quite a few moving pieces, and it's really important to make sure that the right people are pulled in at the right times, and that vendors are identified and contacted and reached back out to and things like that. And it's really important to have a project manager, ideally from within your team, who's able to do this, and that you help free up their capacity to work on this. And that project manager has a good eye towards the overall business and a good working relationship with folks and things like that. Then there's the needs assessment, and you guys were all on the call. I keep referencing it, but I spent the bulk of the time really talking about how do you build out your process flow, and then think through what are, for each step in the process flow within your business, how do you identify what the need to have and nice to have technology pieces are. And then also going back to thinking about the previous page, what are your need to haves and your nice to haves for all the other criteria. I heard from a couple people, I think, in the survey responses and the comments, this felt like it could be sort of a tedious and unnecessary exercise, considering that a lot of these businesses are the same. And for two reasons, I think that could be true for some businesses, but for two reasons, I generally still would recommend this. The first is that we operate in a space where Food Hubs is sort of a broad term that encompasses so many different businesses. I was reviewing again the other day the NGFN 2013 Food Hub survey results, and was struck once again by the term Food Hub defining so many different businesses in terms of the customers that they serve, the suppliers that they work with, whether or not they have a brick and mortar facility, whether or not they do processing. All of these things are different, and there's such nuances in how these businesses are being developed that I think that it's not appropriate to just say that we're all the same, and doing this process is oftentimes reinventing the wheel. The other is that if you don't do this exercise, then oftentimes when you're talking to vendors and asking for a view into their features and functionality and other services, you won't really be in the driver's seat. They'll be pitching to you what they think is important, and they'll be really selling you on the bells and whistles, but you won't be in that driver's seat being able to really say, okay, well, I know what I need, and I need to ask the right questions and see how your functionality fits into what I need. So that's sort of my response to folks who might be feeling like, oh, God, this is a tedious and overwhelming exercise that it doesn't really make sense to do. That said, and the next slide I'll talk through timeline in more detail. But I don't see this as a huge 4-month process. I see this as several really thoughtful strategic meetings with the right folks on the team that you've assembled. So definitely should not be perceived to be an overwhelming, tedious process. Once you have developed sort of the overall needs assessment, then the next phase is really around building the pipeline of potential vendors you're thinking of working with, doing some vetting on them, and narrowing it down through research. And so just a couple points on this is to first, don't go overboard here. This isn't an exercise of developing a list of 20 vendors and then culling it down to 4 or 5. I think it's really starting with, doing some Google research and asking around to get a list of maybe 5 to 10 vendors, and then culling it down to 3 to 6 very quickly that you want to start doing research on, with the goal at the end of the step to having 1 or 2 vendors that you're really excited about going through far more in-depth research and discussion with. I just wanted to make sure that it didn't come across that this was sort of, an overwhelming, very lengthy process where you need to start with 20 vendors. I also wanted to cover a couple of points on in-house development. The first is that when I say in-house development, to me that covers both you actually hire or have a developer on staff that develops a solution for you, or you working with an outside vendor to develop a solution that's customized completely to your needs. So those are both of those things I'm sort of grouping into the in-house development process. A couple of people asked, when is it the right time to consider in-house development? So just a couple of thoughts on that, I think. The first might be if your needs are really unique, that you felt like any off-the-shelf solution you would have to customize so much and would be so expensive that it just wasn't worth it, and you wanted to really just develop your own. The flip side might be if that your needs are very, very simple, and a series of Excel spreadsheets or FileMaker Pro could be a very applicable solution, and you don't want to put out the money to do something that's more complex. So those are two. The other might be that if you feel like you've put in quite a bit of intellectual capital already in the spreadsheets or solutions that you have in-house, and even if they're not working for you, there's a lot to them already, and you want somebody to come in and help you build on top of that. And then I think finally, if you felt like technology could be a really key point of differentiation for you, and you really want it to be a piece of your competitive advantage, then I would suggest going ahead and thinking about an in-house solution. And then the last point in terms of evaluating and selecting, I got some great feedback that, is it always feasible to do a free trial period here? And the answer is no. There's going to be some technologies that are much easier, some vendors that can much more easily provide you with the free trial period, or that work in such a way that you don't need to do a lot of training amongst your staff and your users before you can use it. And in those scenarios, if it's really easy to deploy, then a free trial period makes a lot of sense. If it's not so easy to deploy, then that might not make sense, and then you'll want to do much more in-depth sort of demos and maybe referrals, talking to other customers that have used their software and things like that. So I wanted to recognize that a free trial period isn't always a viable option. All right, so a couple words on sort of timeline. Again, I want to reiterate that all of this shouldn't be considered an onerous a task. So assembling the team, I think that that's sort of a 1 week. The management, the leadership team of your Food Hub gets together and identifies, again, a project manager, works with that project manager to then identify the skills that are needed and to establish and identify the folks who would be engaged. It might take over a week to get them all engaged, just because obviously there's quite a bit of back and forth in communication. But this is, to me, it's quick decision making. You don't have to spend a lot of time doing research here. It's really about getting the right decision makers in the room and selecting the people who are going to participate. The needs assessment, so the process of developing that process flow and establishing requirements and things like that, I don't really see this as a month-long session. When you actually select a vendor, you'll go through a much more detailed, you may go through a much more detailed sort of requirements development process. But at the needs assessment phase, we're looking to really get at high level. What are your processes? What are the general needs that you have? And so one way to go about this would be to get the right people in a room and do sort of a 2-3 hour session where you draft out the process flow, and then you talk through, okay, what is it that our current state of technology looks like, and where do we want it to go? And then that could be a document that your project manager distributes out to other core members of the team that you've assembled to get feedback on. So this could be 1, maybe 2 or 3 weeks if you feel like getting all the people in the room and getting feedback will take longer. But that's the sort of general vision I see around how this would work. Building the pipeline and researching, this is a 3 to 6 week process, I think. I think a couple weeks to build the pipeline through Google searching and referrals and, just some talking to networks that you have and developing out that pipeline. And then setting up doing online research and then setting up meetings with vendors to get their demos and pitches and things like that, and maybe do a little bit of reference gathering with, again, the end goal of ending with maybe 1 or 2 vendors. And then the last, evaluation and selection. I think if you end the building pipeline phase with just 1 vendor, then it might just take you a couple weeks to further evaluate them and select them. And if you end with 1 vendor and you're not in a position where you can do a free trial period, then, again, a couple weeks or 3 weeks might be reasonable. If you end your build pipeline and research phase with 2 vendors, then you might take a slightly longer time, 6 weeks. where you're doing the research, you're doing the free trials where it's appropriate, and coming to a great final decision. A lot of times you're just going to select a vendor and there's a stock sort of pricing and agreement and you just sign it. There might be some instances where there's something very customized in terms of what you're looking for, and so I recognize that there's sort of agreements, development, and pricing negotiations that may be on top of the 3 to 6 weeks I'm talking about here. So this is just a quick reiteration of sort of what I see a potential format for a requirements list could be through a spreadsheet like this, where you have, and again, the vision of this could be a couple of the key team members in a room brainstorming this and getting it on paper. But first is, what's your core business? What's the overview? What's the vision and mission of your food hub? What's your basic set of revenue streams and operational flow? And then having a row that's for each function. So something like, function 1 might be preseason crop planning. Function 2 might be working with your growers to identify their incoming supply. Function 3 might be developing sales lists and sales and availability lists for your buyers on a weekly basis. So fill in all your functions in the leftmost column, and then for each function, so each function is a row now, and then answering the questions of, how is this process executed? What current technology and non-technology solutions are being used to track, use, and share the data, and then what is your ideal nice to have? What's your ideal state, and then what are your need to have? And then at the end, really going back to that list of other selection criteria that I mentioned, and having a group discussion of which ones of these are really important to us, and what do we need the nice to have and the need to have to be. So new slide here that really tries to answer a couple questions, because people sort of said, okay, now I have my requirements list, what do I do now? So let's say you have your requirements list, you've done a lot of vetting to create a list of 10 vendors that you're interested in, and maybe 3 or 4 that bubble up to the top that are the highest potential. Just a couple points about how you then go about connecting with them and evaluating their technology. The first is, for the most part, most of you are on this call because you're ready to make a real legitimate investment in a technology that's in the thousands or tens of thousands of dollars range, or is maybe going to be an ongoing 1 to 3, 4% of your revenue. So all of these are very substantial decisions and spend, large amounts of spend. So very important to not just think about your technology provider as a vendor, but as a strategic partner, and really treat them as such throughout the selection process, and then so that you're setting the right stage for when you go and transition to working together. So in that vein, I think it's very helpful to provide companies that you want a demo from and you want some information from with a bit of an info packet that maybe is just the spreadsheet or the sort of form that we talked about on the previous page. Maybe it's just that. But whatever version of that you feel like is scrubbed and able to be shared externally, share that with any vendor that you're interested in talking to. And then ask for a customized script and features and proposal that meets your specific needs. So make sure you're not, try to get away from just the stock demo that you might get, or, they might direct you to a demo they've already recorded on the website, and really push to talk to the person who can sit down with you and go through and understand your requirements and give you a demo that is aligned with what you're looking for. A lot of the reason why I think this is a really helpful way to go about this is, the way that a vendor responds to your preparedness and thinking about what you need and is willing to enable to customize how they work with you throughout the selection process is a great indicator of how willing and able they are to be a strategic partner with you long term, and how they'll sort of respond to your needs after deployment. So I think that's one important reason why this is a very good way to go about it. Not only will you make the best selection for your functionality needs, but you'll also get a really good view into how you'll work with them longer term. And then the last 2 points, they're conducting extensive due diligence, including referrals and trials when feasible. So, I think this is obviously what is the company's ability to meet your features and functionality needs and all your other selection criteria. You also want to really think about, what's the overall company stability, how long has it been around, and also, how nimble is it and how able is it to sort of react to trends within the food hub and local food space. What's their sort of long-term interest in the industry? Are you the only food hub that they're working with, or do they have an interest in working with many food hubs and therefore are willing to sort of see you as a partner as they enter or grow in a specific industry? So there's a lot to really consider when you think about due diligence, and it can go beyond just the basic, again, features, functionality, and other considerations. And then finally, I think early on, really think through what is a realistic deployment date for the technology that you want to implement. I think for sometimes there might be a drop dead date that you must have it out before at preseason crop planning time frame for the next year. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to implement it because things get too busy or your growers aren't willing to. So really think through: are there drop dead dates, and is that drop dead date realistic? And in all communications, starting from the very get-go, make that really clear to the vendors you're working with. Engage from them. Is that feasible? How likely is it? Ask them to communicate with you. What are the big stumbling blocks that oftentimes will prevent the deployment timeline to be met? How can you, as a food hub, address those proactively? How can the vendor address them proactively? And I think again, this really allows for you and the vendor to be starting off with a strategic relationship rather than as a vendor relationship. So I think it's a really important point. All right. So this is a slide that we covered in the previous presentation, but just returning to it very briefly, just to reiterate the importance of thinking about return on investment in everything that you do and in the decisions that you make. So, when you are ready to make a decision on a vendor, it's very critical that you truly believe that the increase in income and profitability that it can bring you is worth, and then some, the total cost of the solution that you're purchasing. So you should really understand, and be cognizant of what are the drivers of that increase in income. Is it your ability to reduce your costs because your staff don't have to spend lots of time doing manual things in Excel? Is it the fact that you can tap into new supply or tap into new buyers who otherwise would not be able to work with you? Is it your ability to meet regulatory and customer requirements that opens up a new buyer base? So really be thoughtful about what are going to be the drivers of the increase in income that you anticipate, so that once you actually do deploy the software, you have something in mind to sort of be thinking about that need to happen. And if they don't happen after a year or 2 years or 6 months, whatever your time frame is, you can go back to the vendor and go back internally to say, okay, is this, what do we need to do to make sure that we achieve that ROI that we had, initially identified. Great. And then finally, some sort of general pitfalls to avoid that touch on some of the questions that came up in some of the comments and post-call survey responses. So a couple of pitfalls. I think the first, I've said this time and again, but definitely don't buy on features alone. Features is going to be great, but ability to work with you effectively, the platform, the cost structure, all of those things are really important considerations as well. Taking too short-term of a view. So you obviously don't want to buy a piece of software that's going to be what you need 10 years from now, but you also don't want to buy a piece of software and then have it not be appropriate for you 1 or 2 years from now. So in thinking through your features and functionality and identifying what's nice to have versus need to have, push yourself to think 1 or at least 2 years out of where do you anticipate your business to grow, and can the software, maybe not in its current form, but can you upgrade to a more advanced version later, or do they have the capacity to customize solutions for you as you grow? Selecting based on bells and whistles is something that happens to many, many companies, particularly startups, but they get a really snazzy demo from a vendor and they're really excited about a lot of the cool features, integration and automatic development of various, interesting graphics and things like that you might see, and all of that is really exciting, but that your excitement around it might prevent you from recognizing to what extent is that software truly addressing the core functions that you need. Then there's sort of automatically buying the industry standard. And so if there's folks that that are making the decision to buy XYZ software, it might just feel easiest to just buy it because if your colleagues are doing it, then it must be good. And sometimes this could be true. I think things that are industry standard should definitely be on your high potential list when you're developing out that pipeline, but really do yourself the service of figuring out your unique needs and making a decision based on them, and not just defaulting to the industry standard. You might find that they're not meeting your specific needs and that there's a better solution out there. And as I said earlier, really consider the company's long-term stability. I think there's many reasons why working with a startup is exciting. They're nimble and they're willing to respond to your needs. And so I'm not suggesting that you not work with startups, but that when you do work with startups, ask them the tough questions about what is their financial and personnel stability and their ability to be there long term for what you need. Similar to what I said earlier, make sure that you select a vendor that has some level of commitment to food hubs and to the work that you're doing. So it oftentimes doesn't make sense to go look for an ERP full service vendor that only has a couple food companies in its portfolio, because their willingness and ability to meet some of the specific requests that you might have will be low. And the second to last is definitely make sure that throughout the process, and this is why it's so important to build that team that I was describing, is just getting buy-in from the appropriate stakeholders. So this is specifically the folks on your staff that are going to use the software, as well as growers and buyers that are going to use their software. Whether or not they're part of the team, make sure that the project manager is getting their buy-in and input. Switching from even what feels like a tedious set of Excel and Google Docs spreadsheets and making them all work, it might feel like, oh, it's a no-brainer to transition to this new software, but there's definitely a painful period when you're making the transition, because people, as tedious as it might be, are used to doing it. You want to make sure that the folks that are going to be the users are excited about the new solution and are motivated and understand why it's so exciting to transition to a new piece of technology. And then finally is, especially for that project manager that I described, that everybody on staff who is going to need the time to make the selection and participate in the deployment should have ample time to do so. So, again, this could be part of what stage in the year do you want to be thinking about technology development or selection and deployment, making sure that there is some capacity on your staff to do that. Otherwise, technology is an important strategic decision, but is oftentimes not as urgent as everyday fires that you're putting out, and then this will get left in the dust if if it's in a very busy time or you haven't freed up that time for folks. So last two slides are, I think the first is, I know in the last presentation we sort of threw up a list of vendors that could be helpful for you to start as you're building your pipeline. What I wanted to do before that is start with this slide, which is just what I mean by the various categories of types of solution. And you might find that given your unique food hub operational flow and food hub structure, that you only want to find vendors that are in a specific category or that maybe cross two different categories. So this is a helpful, I think, frame to start narrowing it down. So the first is sort of what I'm calling general ERP, and just to reiterate, an ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning, and it's basically a business management software that collects, stores, and interprets data across many activities within your business. So everything from maybe planning to inventory management to marketing to delivery, shipping, logistics, and all of the data is sort of integrated so they speak to each other rather than having disparate systems to manage each of those elements. And when I say ERP, quote unquote, general, is what I'm referring to as sort of traditional ERP systems that focus on efficiently managing the internal operations of your business. Many systems that are out there have been designed for wholesale distribution businesses. Some are specific to the food sector. Some sort of reference and work with a number of different industries. The second is what I'm calling ERP, although I'm not sure that that's how they refer to themselves, but what I'm calling sort of food hub specific ERP solutions. And what I mean by that is systems that cover quite a few different aspects and activities of a business, but that they've been designed to meet the specific needs of certain types of food hubs. And so they oftentimes address the relationships between hubs and growers and or between hubs and buyers. Because they're sort of food hub specific ERP systems, they don't always have all of the full ERP functionality. So you might find that you need to go to a different vendor for your accounting or for some other elements of the business because, again, they're covering very core food hub specific functionality, but they haven't maybe sometimes yet or don't have plans to develop some of the other features that you might find in a general ERP system. The third is an online marketplace. So these are sort of e-commerce platforms that allow growers and hubs to post products and for buyers to make purchases, and they tend to fulfill sort of the transactional and inventory posting, inventory management and sales part of the equation. They sometimes do and sometimes don't also, fulfill logistics and financial management and accounting and whatnot. The fourth is sort of a CSA exchange. Again, I was struck when reading the NGFN survey, 2013 survey results, that quite so many food hubs are focused on CSA as a portion or all of their sales, and so there are quite a few emerging pieces of software that specifically meet the needs of those types of farms and food hubs. Then there's farm systems, and those are somewhat less relevant likely to folks on the call, but these are the systems that support farm planning and management, crop planning, supply management, cost tracking. And you might find that the deployment of these to your growers is very helpful, or that for whatever your specific needs are as a food hub, that working with a provider like this is actually really helpful to your needs. And then the sort of function specific are any pieces of software that are designed for specific things. So one to manage customer relationships, one to manage accounting, one to manage e-commerce. Those are sort of, and most of these are not industry specific, but are, just great pieces of software that are very good at addressing that specific function. And then this is the same slide that we put on the last presentation, and just want to reiterate again, it's by no means comprehensive. It highlights some of the great vendors and software providers out there that I know I've heard about in talks with various food hubs around the country, but I know that there's dozens more behind this list that, if you did some Google searching and asked your colleagues and, posted questions on message boards and things like that, you'd likely develop an even larger and more robust list than this.